Good morning, everyone. Um, as Jordan said, I'm Nick Connor. I'm partner at Parisi Consultant, a communication firm focused on outcomes, not outputs. So, as Georgia just said, we're here today to discuss the government's flagship plan and infrastructure bill, which we expect, to go through to House of Lords and pass very shortly. Now, this has been framed by the government as the cornerstone of their activity. It's their plan for change, the bill that promises to lift bureaucratic barriers that have long slowed down the delivery of housing, infrastructure, and clean energy projects. Deputy Prime Minister Andrew Rayner had described it as the foundation for the biggest building boom in a generation. The Chancellor's spend review, keep look out in the news today, plans us to build on this ambition, setting out 113 billion pounds in capital infrastructure plan, with major funding for transport, nuclear projects like Sizewell C, and commitment to net zero base budgeting. Together, these priorities signal the government's belief that infrastructure reform is essential for economic renewal, with independent analysts estimating the bill could add up to 7.5 billion to the UK economy over the next decade. But infrastructure reform doesn't stop at housing and energy. We're also seeing major shifts in how it powers our future economy, from the national grid's planned upgrades to reclassify data centers as national significance infrastructure. This comes aimed at rising concerns. Heathrow saw disruption from power outages. Spain and Ireland are facing growing grid constraints driven by energy-intensive data hubs, and with AI and electrification driving ever greater demand, especially across logistics and transports, the stakes are high. This is particularly true for electric vehicles, a sector critical to UK's net zero ambitions. Companies across the country are looking to scale fleet electrification, but delays in planning approval for charging infrastructure are becoming a real bottleneck. Without faster, more joined up planning processes, we risk falling short not only on energy security, but also on decarbonising transport, one of our highest emitting sectors. So the question we're asking today is this: does the plan and infrastructure bill go far enough? And critically, does it do enough to align our infrastructure strategy with the demands of net zero economy? So to help us answer this, we're joined today by Matthew Adams, Head of Transport and Innovation at the Association for Renewable Energy and Clean Technology, REA, the UK's largest trade body for renewable energy and clean tech. Representing over 500 members, the REA advocates for policies that embed commercial and environmentally sustainable future. We're also joined by Richard Earl, R&D Director at EO Charging, the EV infrastructure company helping fleet transition to zero carbon transport with electric vans, trucks, buses, and cars. With over 100,000 chargers deployed across 1,700 sites, EO has been pioneering fleet electrification for over a decade. So please put your questions to Matthew and Richard in the chat. And hello, gentlemen. Um, Matthew, I want to start with you, if that's okay. And why not we start with that big question? Does the UK government's planning reforms go far enough?
Look, I think that the planning reform is a good start. It's the sort of result of maybe 5, 6 years of industry feedback. Particularly around things like street work licensing, where we are seeing reform. We're seeing on-street charge point operators, for example, no longer having to go through the arduous process of getting a Section 50 license. Instead, going through a streetworks manager process, which should be a lot simpler, cheaper, and we get things in the ground quicker. Most importantly, right? Yeah, so that's really good, but there are some missed opportunities. It would be fair to say. So on-street charging is a big part, one part of the puzzle. But for a lot of people who are looking at EVs for the first time, One of the big barriers, which we see often, is the fact they can't charge at home and don't feel able to buy an EV as a result. Of course, we could make that a lot easier by giving them a wider array of solutions. So we're seeing the growth of things like cross pavement solutions coming onto the market now. You've probably seen, some of them are very good at advertising. So we've seen like a Turbocharge, or Dragon's Den, the Trojan, Charge Gully, etc. Coming up onto the market and making a big impact. But at the moment, they still have to pay for a Section 50 license. They still have to get planning permission, and we've seen that more than doubles the cost of installation. And we Private Eye did an article a couple of months ago that said it took more than 2 years to get an installation. Like, the writer was trying to get one and hadn't got one after 2 years because of this arduous red tape process. So actually, the planning infrastructure bill could make a lot of difference there as well. And just by changing I think it's clause 43, and just going and cross pavement solutions, pretty easy amendment. And I'm sure Vicky will talk about that on the next panel a bit later as well, as we're doing a joint campaign on it at the moment. But doing something like that would be a really easy way of suddenly unlocking an EV for maybe 8 million people
That's
with stroke of a pen.
Yeah, I mean that's absolutely crazy. Two years to wait. Richard, you're on the ground. Obviously that's 2 years for sort of commercial. They're not commercial, residential. From a commercial, dealing with fleets here. I mean, does the UK have the infrastructure today to support the transition to electric fleets? And with the rapid growth expected, with much more vans, trucks, and lorries, switching to electric. Will we have what is needed for tomorrow?
So, fundamentally, if every vehicle was to go electric today, we wouldn't have the grid capacity to cope. We wouldn't have the ability for all of these vehicles to charge. We wouldn't have the distribution, the transmission of all of the electricity from the generators to the vehicles. So fundamentally, no. However, we are on a journey, and so far we've fleets are electrifying, and we're beginning to connect all of the grids up together, and we are growing the electrical network within the country. However, the grid connection process is the slowest and the most expensive part of any electrification program. So, if you're electrifying a bus depot, or electrifying a last mile fleet depot, or building a truck charging hub, the grid connection is the thing you worry about most. It's how do I get electricity to my site? And what do we need to do in order to get electricity to my site? Now, for some, a lot depends on location. So some lucky depots are close by to sort of suitable transformers, and it's relatively easy to get a connection. Whereas others, they're a long way away. They have to cross the substation's the other side of the road, and so therefore it's very expensive to try and dig up the road and coordinate, etc. Now we are seeing some great improvements, but it's definitely a journey that we're on. And every time you speak to a fleet manager or a construction manager, the grid connection is the biggest pain point.
Yeah, and we're seeing the national grid sort of come out with a 35 billion, I believe, sort of grid upgrade. That's still years away. And even though they put in some punchy targets to deliver, I think there's not many people watching the Shangans or things like HS2 to think that they're going to deliver in time. So are we in real danger here that our rolling out of electric vehicles, particularly in fleets, is we're just going to be behind the upgrades? And what is the answer if that's true? Is things like microgrids? Are we going to see things like that become much more prominent whilst the grid tries to catch up?
So, unfortunately, there is no easy answer. There is no magic silver bullet. This is a complex problem, and I think the really good thing, and one of the things we do need to celebrate, is that everyone is engaged. There's no one part of industry or government that's sort of like buried their head in the sands and ignoring the problem. So we've got legislators, we've got politicians, we've got civil servants, we've got organizations such as Ofgem, all engaged and aware of this transition. So we are all beginning to pull in the right direction. Now, is it perfect? No. Are there things we can improve? Yes. But I think fundamentally we do need to recognize that everyone is engaged, and government and all these organizations do come in for a bit of a bashing. But I think it is worth pointing out that there are a lot of people within government and a lot of people that Matt and I engage with who are really committed to making this happen and listening and wanting to make change. We were on an EV All Parliamentary Group Committee meeting a few weeks ago, and one of the things that we raised then was around a simple thing like reclassifying truck weight limits so that it doesn't classify as an HGV but rather as a van. And within a few weeks, changes were being made, and it's like, fantastic. People are beginning to listen, coordinate, and realize that we do need to make a change. Now, moving forward, we do need to, the grid. If we've got a partner, a customer who's looking to electrify their depot, then we do have to take them on a journey. We do have to engage with the DNOs. We do have to engage with the utility suppliers. We do need to engage with the local councils for planning permissions, and it is a complex process. And we've built up a number of years experience of navigating this, and so there are ways and sort of abilities to sort of speed things up, or if you design your site like this, you could reduce this amount of time, or you could put some extra capital over here that would increase the cost but improve time to market. So there are things you can do to speed up the electrification of depots, but it's still really slow. And I think the government has made changes recently to the planning bills. So there was an announcement a couple of weeks ago where EV charge points were exempt from planning permission, which is fantastic. And it's like, great, we've been lobbying for that. Matt's been lobbying for that, but it's very much it's a segment of the market. It's not everyone, and of those remaining within the planning permission process, it's still a slow process. And I think the planning reform bill that is hopefully going to be passed through will speed that up, which is really good. But then we still have questions over, okay, well, if you're going to remove some segments out of the planning bill, you've still got people, you've still got councils, you've still got committees meeting to try and approve these uh, applications, but legislation won't speed up the actual process. You need people. So therefore, is the investment in there for planning officers and specialists who can advise these people, is that part of the process being looked at as well? And I think that's going to be, that will be the next layer of the onion as we unpick this.
Matthew, before we go into that next layer of onion, let me just remind everyone, if you've got any questions, please put them into the chat and we'll put them to Richard and Matthew shortly. Okay, let's go to that layer of onion. That outer layer sounds good, sounds really tasty. Central government seems on board, but it's even with the planning reform bill coming through, local government could be still a blocker. What do you think is needed at that local level? I mean, for example, we recently had data centers set up as critical infrastructure, national infrastructure. I mean, do we need that for electric vehicle charging, particularly in fleets, which are sort of the lifeblood to the UK economy?
Yeah, I think bringing things to critical national infrastructure, I think it's going to happen in time, right? Like at the moment, we're seeing we've seen the smart and secure electricity system framework being introduced by government. That's going to put on quite large cybersecurity requirements, for example, on charge point operators or anyone that is a load controller. So we're going to see cybersecurity requirements equivalent to those of critical national infrastructure at the moment put on charge point operators, among others in the sector. So actually, what we're going to find is we're going to get all the cons of being critical national infrastructure, but we're not going to get any of the positives, because we won't be classified as it. So, not say better cybersecurity is a con, but just that obviously it becomes more it is more arduous and all the rest of it and more expensive. So um, there is we will probably have to go to it, and I would like to see that happen in time, going towards critical national infrastructure. But there's probably a little bit of hesitancy from the sector as a whole to jump in that straight away. But yeah, I think it's going to happen at some point quite soon, I hope.
And that sounds expensive. And I'm looking to you here, Richard, because you're at the forefront of bringing this in. I mean, where's the money coming from? I mean, does the government need to step up? I mean, is there commercial opportunities where people would want to build out this infrastructure for fleet and cars because there's a commercial opportunity there, or does it need sort of greater government support to get the infrastructure, going before there's commercial opportunities?
I think it depends on who you ask. If you ask a sort of like a customer, they're like, "Yes, give me all the money." Whereas if you speak to the government, they're like, "No, the market's mature enough. You do it yourself." So I think that there's probably a balance in the middle. Now, where the government has been very successful is using financial incentives to stimulate a market. So we saw this in the early days of the domestic EV charging with charge point grants and etc. We've then seen commercial grant workplace charging schemes, and we've also seen cross pavement schemes. So the government is very good at stimulating a market through incentives. I think where the challenge comes is when they remove those incentives. If you look at places like Norway, they've kept their incentives for a long time, and that's stimulated the EV rollout, and that's been very, very positive. If you look at, let's say, London and the UK, you can see a few question marks appearing. So, for example, why isn't the congestion charge exempt for EVs, or the low emission zones? Why is that not exempt? How come the expensive vehicle tax is not being is being applied to EVs, and why isn't the fuel duty accelerator being kicked in to fund EV infrastructure rollout? So there are some sort of question marks around the incentives, and we continually raise these with government, and I think it's complex, and which is why it's not happened. But you do question, is there joined up thinking across the strategy? And I think also, but then if you flip across to the other side and you focus on the customers, what we're now seeing is that we get, if we take, for example, the bus funding, the Zebra bus fund from the government, that's been very successful at setting up bus depots, electrification of bus depots within London. And what we're seeing is that, yes, there is a large capital outlay up front, but the total cost of ownership now of that electric fleet is now below that of a diesel fleet. And so customers are going, oh, right, we're at the start of the journey and we're already seeing the cost of the cost of electrification being significantly better than our previous fleet. We're seeing service intervals of vehicles move from sort of like 6 months to 2 years. We're seeing brake pads on buses replaced once every 7 years. And you go, that's unbelievable. It's incredible. And so the I think what will sort of there is a tipping point where customers go, oh, right, actually the cost of running an electric fleet is lower than my previous internal combustion engine fleet, and therefore, right, it's now the right time to make that transition. Now, where the challenge comes is the electrical infrastructure is expensive to install. You've got grid connections, you've got expensive equipment. So what we're exploring with our customers, the different consumption models. Can they do charging or infrastructure as a service? Can we build up sort of shared depots to spread the cost across different customers? And we're beginning to see though that sort of innovative financial piece from the large infrastructure funds, sort of enabling us to offer these services to our customers.
Before I come to Matthew to ask, what the government can do, but Richard, you talked about, sort of changing the buses there, and you talked about the journey you're taking your customers on and things you look at. So give us a bit of a bit of a sci-fi vision of what the UK will look when we have fully integrated electric vehicles from everywhere from Land's End to Johnny Groats, and all our lorries, trucks, buses, cars, bicycles are electric. What will our towns look like? What will our motorways look like? What will it look like? And I'll come and then Matthew, if you follow on straight after saying, what's the journey does our government have to do to get us to that point?
Yeah, sure. So, with my sort of my crystal ball, I'm the air will be clear and the noise will be low, and that will be amazing. We saw in COVID when there were no vehicles or how blue the sky was, and I remember that vividly. And and that's where we're going to get to. And electric vehicles bring many benefits. They're quieter, they don't pollute, and they're easier to drive, so that it's more so driving will be more pleasurable and the environment will benefit. Now, from a sort of an infrastructure perspective, what we will see is a massively distributed grid. We will see microgrids all over the place, local energy generation, the balancing of those different energy generation units across the grid. So, you might be able to have solar and wind on a property, and then you might be able to export that to your neighbor, and your neighbor pays for it. And and then we will also see distributed significant renewables across the grid. So lots of offshore, lots of wind farms, lots of solar. And then the key part will be, okay, well, how do we connect all of these assets together, and how do we distribute it across the country, and then how do we ensure that all of the vehicles and the consumers behave nicely? So therefore, how do we manage voltage swings? How do we manage frequency swings? And ensuring that if I plug my vehicle to grid enabled bus in, that's not going to swing the voltages of that area out of sync so that my next door factory is going to suffer. So it's going to be a very distributed, very smart and very interconnected network. And I think hopefully fairly resilient. If one generator goes down, well, then the others will kick in. And so it's going to be a sort of a very um, democratic grid of generation and consumption. And I think it's transitioning to that from where we are today, which is built on a traditional sort of like centralized command structure. Transitioning to that sort of utopian distributed grid is going to be really exciting.
Matthew, bring in some dystopia to Richard's dystopia, please. Um, how we could get there from policy perspective, but let's throw the black swans in. We're already seeing, from one side, Reform UK against, seem to be against a lot of solar panels going on farmlands and wind turbines on land wind turbines. Equally, we're also seeing, ironically, the Green Party being quite against infrastructure, sort of Ipswich during the general election, they picked up a seat by going against pylons. So that there seems to be a groundswell which is turning in the ballot box against all this. And as to quote Richard, if we can have wind farms and solar farms all over the place, with central planning coming in, could we also see a reaction from local levels?
Yeah, so we've got grid and we got infrastructure, right? So start with infrastructure and then we'll work out how we power it. So go for infrastructure first. Like, one of the key things we see is that, obviously, yeah, local authorities are thinly resourced, need as much support as possible to actually get some of this infrastructure out at a local level. So whether that is charging infrastructure, whether that's wind, whether it's solar or whatever else. And we're kind of seen with the Levi Fund that we've had a capability fund that's going to end at the end of this financial year. There's a big question mark there where actually, are we going to lose the hundreds of Levi officers that have been funded? And as a result, we're going to lose a huge amount of built up knowledge and skills over the last 2-3 years that we're going to need to replace. And that is a key concern. I think one of the key things I would be doing if I was government would be working out a new capability fund for local authorities to keep those skills in house and ensure that we are able to roll out infrastructure even quicker than we have been doing currently. So that would be step one. Then we've got things like okay, well, actually, a lot of local authorities are starting to develop like charging plans, for example, right? These charging plans, for whatever reason, most local authorities don't talk to local fleet operators, before they put the infrastructure in the ground. I know lots of taxi firms, for example, they're literally banging down the door of their local authority saying, look, here are the streets where all of our taxi drivers with EVs live. Please put some infrastructure in there. And they don't want to know because they don't have the capacity. So I think, one thing that we should be looking at going forward is certainly looking at going towards mandation of talking to fleets, or considering fleets for in when we're rolling out public infrastructure, in that sense, for which I think would help a lot. But then we look at things like, okay, well, I want to, for example, extend the range of my journey. So I'm going from John O'Groats to Land's End. But I don't have a depot at Land's End that I can go charge at. But luckily for me, where I'm dropping off whatever it is, my customer at the end point, maybe he has a charge point that he's willing to share. Maybe he's going to develop a shared charging network. We're seeing quite a few companies now start doing that, and I think if government can help answer questions around the public charge point regs and shared infrastructure, that's going to be a massive help, because I think depots do want to share their infrastructure as much as possible and build a community, extend those ranges, but there are some serious questions on whether suddenly that becomes public charging or not. So we do need those questions answered, absolutely. So okay, so let's say we probably haven't resolved infrastructure, but we're getting there, right? And probably the last thing is, actually we've got about 700,000, 800,000 domestic charge points in the UK that are just sitting on driveways being underutilized. Can we improve that utilization? Can we provide a grant or an incentive, say 50, 100 quid, to put one of those charge points onto a sharing app of some sort of charge point sharing app? I mean, we think if government spent 5 million of the 200 million they committed to EV charging in the November spending review, there would be probably another 100,000 charge points accessible within kind of 3-4 months to the public. That would more than double the entire public charging network, which would be pretty phenomenal, and would really help really to encourage people to buy an EV if they've got all of these extra charge points available to them. So that's the infrastructure side. Now, grid side gets more complicated, and I think the grid problem has been well understood for a while. One of the problems with grid, of course, is actually skills gaps developing. We did a skills report last year, and of the DNOs we interviewed, half of them said they won't be able to cope. They won't have the civil engineers available to them in the next 5 years to actually improve the grid. So this is a serious concern, and electrical engineering skills entirely. I mean, this country, it looks like we're going towards disaster because there simply isn't enough people at the moment with the right skills, and we're not getting people trained up quick enough. And the average age of a sort of electrical engineer or someone working for DNO is about 50, 55. These people are going to retire in the next 5, 10 years. So that's a really key concern that we're going to have to address going forward, absolutely. And then of course there are other areas like that are well understood, like way leaves, for example. I mean, if you look at the way leaves process to go over third-party land and get a grid connection, it's not even digital. You can't even check the process. Like these are things that certainly in my head could probably have been resolved like 10, 15, 20 years ago at the turn of the internet. But nonetheless, obviously these are massive companies, and this would be a hugely expensive thing to do. So I appreciate DNOs probably have other priorities at the moment. But things like making a digital process for way leaves, simplifying the process, instead of it taking 2 years and then having to go to court, for example, which then take another 18 months, 2 years. It can be ridiculous if you can't get an agreement. So simplifying things like way leaves as well, and simplifying the grid connections process. We've got, was it 5, 6 DNOs now? But they all have different processes to connect to the grid, and some of our members say it depends on the time of day and who they call as to what the process is. That can't be right. That can't be normal. Like that, there has to be a better way going forward. I'm not saying that happens all the time, and there are some really good examples of work DNOs are doing, but that's certainly some of the feedback we've had in the past. So we need to get that right, and we need to put some more investment into DNOs to help with that process, to help get the right skills in place.
Thanks, Matthew. We've got some questions from the floor. If you have a question, please put them into the Q&A session and we'll put them to the panel. I think this one's directed at you, Richard. John Trueholm asks, you mentioned that EV buses would need brake pad replacements for around, wouldn't need it for around 7 years. Why would an EV bus brake be more efficient?
So the it's regenerative braking. So the brakes are just not used as heavily. So as they begin to slow down, they take the foot off the accelerator, and then the engine braking of the vehicle slows it down. Now, I might have got the 7 years wrong. It might be 2 years, but it's definitely significantly longer than the sort of diesel ICE vehicle. But yeah, this was one of those anecdotal things that a customer said, and you suddenly realize, wow, that's incredible. That of course. And what we're finding with the bus drivers is a bus driver comes on site and they go, oh, I want to drive the electric one because it's smoother, it's quicker, it's easier to drive. And when they get the diesel buses, they're like, oh, I don't want that. It's noisy, it shakes, and it's harder to drive. So there's anecdotal evidence of, just from the bus companies that drivers really like the electric buses.
Just to go back to something Matthew said in his dystopia picture of the UK, um, skills gap is a big concern across everyone in sort of, I guess, STEM-based industries. How are you finding out at the moment, not just your company, but also for your clients, to have people with those electrical engineering or other skill sets needs? Is there a gap? Is it a struggle? Or is this something just is going to come about as we try and scale?
So I think certainly from our perspective, we are. It's a bit mixed in the sense that we are a national company, so we can recruit from all over the UK for design and construction, design and electrical sort of safety jobs, and then also the construction and installation side. So there's two very broad camps. Um, and so therefore we're able to pick from around the UK. However, it's a small industry. We see a lot of transfer between companies, and so it's quite, there is a small skill set. Sorry, there is a small pool available of that skill set. As we scale, will we have enough? I don't know. I don't. I suspect not. And I think we're at the early days of scaling, and I think it will be in the next few years that as we scale and require more and more engineering designers and installers, that's the point at which we'll suddenly go, there's a skills gap. So I think today we're okay, but over the next couple of years, yes, we probably will struggle.
Thank you. We have another question here, and I'm going to put this one to you, Matthew. Regarding DNO connections, where does Ofgem feature in driving transformation and standardization of this approach?
Yeah, so of course, I mean, so Ofgem approves the investment, going in from the DNOs, every year, and or every couple of years, and I think often, how many people do I want to how many friends at Ofgem do I want to upset? No, Ofgem are doing a really good job, I think. Keeping the DNOs in check. Yes, it can be quite difficult. I mean, to be honest, and I think maybe Ofgem can afford to be a bit more ambitious sometimes. I would say. I mean, we're seeing consultations and things like that, but these consultations. I mean, we saw a consultation on uh, review of pricing happened a couple of years ago, right? And it's taken 3 years to review standing charges. And this is a consultation that started, I think, in 2022, when it was first raised as an issue. I mean, when we responded to the Ofgem consultation in 2019, we said it was going to be a total disaster, and they went ahead and did it anyway and changed standing charges. But when the standing charges consultation happened in 2022, 2023. It's still taking another 2, 3 years. We're still in the consultation process. It's not quite over yet. I think those processes could probably be sped up and yeah, and made more efficient because yeah, if there's a real world issue happening now in an industry that's still finding its feet, you know, it can be quite damaging and painful for those operating on the ground. So I think we do need to. I think Ofgem can probably be a little more efficient, but Ofgem do have a really important role to play and are doing a great job in some areas. But yeah, there are other areas I think we can find better efficiency and streamlining.
I think if I can just add into that, I think, I know that consultation you're talking about, and that's just a sort of like a financial instrumental change. It's a bit of legislation or it's a bit of financial tax. That's not laying concrete. That's not digging up the road. That's not sort of installing power infrastructure. So it's really important that where we can, the government really speeds up those administrative bits so that the big heavy work can progress as quickly as possible.
Thank you. We have a few questions and comments from the floor. So I'm going to read one comment and then one question here. So John Hanson asks, as electric vehicles are heavier, this means more energy has to be recovered on brakes. This means that it is not automatic, but brakes need replacing less often than petrol equivalent vehicles. In addition, this extra mass means more wear on the road, bridges, etc. Also, stop and distance might be increased because of the extra mass, as will be damage in accidents. Hence, maybe there needs to keep the HGV requirement as dependent on moving mass, irrespective of engine type. And then John Tranholm gets back in touch and he asks, are the panel concerned with perceived popularity and approach of reform and their move away from net zero, opening coal mines, etc.? Matthew, do you want to take that reform
Yeah,
question?
yeah, sure. So I mean, on the reform question, yeah, of course. I mean, we've got members who are due to be installing infrastructure in some of the areas reform of one. And there's kind of an open question of, well, is that going to happen now? Are they going to scrap the entire thing? I mean, I think it's quite dangerous, to be honest, to do that. And yeah, it's not just reform I'm worried about. To be honest, though, it's the opposition. We need a strong opposition in this country, and unfortunately, the opposition don't seem to have a policy on EV, on transport in general, and that's quite concerning because yeah, we need someone to hold the government to account. I mean, I think this government are ambitious, but yeah, they are getting things wrong, and someone needs to tell them that. And at the moment, we don't have an effective opposition to do that. But even then, if we look at some of the other parties that have done well at the last election, the Lib Dems, they want people on bikes. They don't really want people in electric cars at all. So actually, there's this whole like all the main parties that get the airline that aren't government aren't effective at scrutinising government at the moment, and that's quite concerning.
Richard, we have this question here. Does the National Grid need to think about microgrids or investing into reform, not Reform UK, I believe, that allows selling energy back to the grid in order to meet decarbonisation, net zero goals, and growing demand?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll also just quickly touch on Mr. Hanson's question about the extra mass. So when the ZEV mandate consultation was launched in Christmas, and over the last January, February, that specific topic was asked, and I think there were tens of thousands of responses to that mandate, and so that topic will have been taken into account when they decided to adjust that planning, that legislation around the weight classification of HGVs. So it was looked at, it wasn't ignored, and based on all the evidence, they therefore made that change. In answer to your question about microgrids, yes, microgrids will be popping up. We're seeing lots more. There's the there's one public charging infrastructure site in just outside Winchester, Newbury Way, that has on-site battery, lots of solar, and lots of charging stations. So that microgrid is that style of microgrid, I think, is one of the first in the UK, but they will become increasingly common as sort of, companies want to electrify. They face the constraints with the DNOs, and actually it will probably potentially make more be cost effective to have a microgrid on site. So the microgrid technology and the smart control of the integration of the solar, the battery, and the EV, that will become that will be a hot topic over the next 5, 10 years technologically. How do we deploy this? How do we control these assets? And then also, how do we interface those assets into the grid? How can we ensure that our fleet customers are sort of, who have suddenly become industrial users of electricity, can reduce their costs, because they're going to have massive flexible assets on site, and therefore there's great opportunity within the sort of the pricing markets, the electricity markets, for these companies to offer flexibility. And that is another area of government interest at the moment, is around how do we stimulate flexibility services within domestic environments and commercial environments. And so I think, yeah, microgrids will be a sort of a big thing coming. And microgrid can be just, scale up from a domestic environment where you've got a heat pump, single EV charge point, and a sort of 3 kilowatt battery and 3 kilowatt solar panels, to a massive bus depot where you've got sort of megawatts of power flowing around. So yes, in answer to your question.
Thank you. Rich and Matthew, I'm going to ask you both for your closing remarks, and I'll start with you, Matthew. But what I would ask you to do is answer two questions. What is the one thing you would like the audience to take away from today's conversation? And please answer this question. Does the government's infrastructure bill go far enough? Go on, Matthew.
Okay, so I suppose firstly, we're getting to a point now in the transition where we've reached a tipping point, and we need to start attracting. We need to make it easier for people to buy EVs and use EVs. We're seeing government slowly realise that. Obviously, they've got the ZEV mandate in. They've set quite high. There's quite stringent sales targets, but they're at the same time, conversely, getting rid of incentives to buy EVs. Whether that's congestion charge, whether that's something else. So I think actually one of the things I'd quite like to see is this group, other people across the sector, is sort of congregate around a few key carrot mechanisms to incentivize EV adoption. And we've just started. We've just signed up to a campaign to get the EV congestion charge exemption again in London, because that's frankly bonkers. That we've gone down a route where we're going to start charging people for coming to London who are driving an EV. So I hope that everyone here on this call and the wider group can correlate behind a few key carrots going forwards. And second question, no, it can go further, but I hope some of the new consultations out at the moment on things like solar canopies and EV will help with that. And I'm sure the spending review today is going to be absolutely fantastic, and I have no doubt that the government are going to pump in billions and billions of pounds in charging infrastructure. But if they don't, then I think we can expect there to be a bit of some strong messaging from industry over the next couple of weeks.
Richard.
So I think the one the one aspect I'd like you to take away, that this is a once in a generational change, and we're seeing a massive transition, fundamental transition to electrification. And the grid is going to look totally different. The way we move is going to look totally different. The way we generate electricity and consume electricity is going to be very different. And I think everyone in government is aware of that. As Matt said, does the bill go far enough? Probably not. Are there still institutional problems? Yes. Is there lack of capacity within the organizations? Yes. So I think, where can we do more? We need to now look at the bit below the planning and the legislation and go, well, how do we enable it? And it's the enabler that I think is the really key bit now to focus on.
Matthew Adams from Recharge UK. Richard Earl from EO Charging. Thank you very much. This has been a fascinating conversation. We wait for this reform to go through on our planning infrastructure so we can have Richard's utopia world in front of us. But thank you very much as well to everyone for joining us today on this conversation. And I believe this is something we're probably going to be talking about for the next few years.